The freezing experiments carried out during World War II involved subjecting prisoners to extreme temperatures in order to study the effects of cold on the human body. Prisoners were immersed in ice-cold water, and some were rapidly rewarmed, causing irreparable damage to the organs. The bamboo torture consisted of inserting bamboo stalks under the victim's skin or into sensitive parts of their body, usually on the extremities or areas such as the fingers or genitals. Bamboo is a plant that grows quickly, and over time it expands, causing deep injuries. The torture with poisonous gas was one of the most brutal forms of medical experimentation during World War II. Prisoners, usually Jews and prisoners of war, were exposed to different types of poisonous gases, such as cyanide, to test their effectiveness as a chemical weapon and study their effects on the human body. The sterilization torture was widely used during totalitarian regimes, such as the Nazi regime, with the aim of controlling and purifying populations considered undesirable. In the Nazi regime, women and men from groups such as Jews, Gypsies, and people with disabilities were subjected to forced sterilization procedures without consent and without proper anesthesia. The biological weapons experiments conducted during World War II, particularly by the Japanese Unit 731, involved exposing prisoners to contagious diseases like anthrax, bubonic plague, and cholera to study the effects of these diseases on humans and test the use of biological agents as weapons of war. Prisoners, including Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, were deliberately infected with these deadly diseases without any treatment, resulting in extreme suffering and mass deaths. In addition to testing biological weapons, doctors sought to develop methods of large-scale dissemination for military use. The Iron Maiden is one of the most infamous and cruel torture tools of the Middle Ages. It consisted of an iron sarcophagus designed to trap the victim inside, with the person's body being crushed against the sharp points of the device. The Iron Maiden had an iron door with nails or metal blades inside, which pierced and cut the victim's body, especially the torso, arms, and head. The method caused a slow and agonizing death, with the points penetrating deeply into the flesh and the victim being left to suffer until death by bleeding, infection, or shock. The bronze bull was a torture and execution tool dating back to ancient Greece. It consisted of a bronze statue in the shape of a bull, with an internal cavity where the victim was placed. The victim was locked inside the structure, and in some cases, the bull was heated to high temperatures, causing the metal to become extremely hot. This resulted in severe burns and agonizing deaths as the victim was slowly cooked alive inside the bull. The sound of the victim screaming inside the statue, amplified by the bull's horns, was heard by those around, making the execution even more terrifying and cruel. The pear of anguish was a torture tool used during the Middle Ages and in subsequent periods, particularly during the Inquisition. It consisted of a metal device in the shape of a pear or cylindrical form, which was inserted into the mouth, vagina, or anus of the victim. The device was then slowly expanded, forcing the victim to endure intense and mutilating pain. Depending on the area in which it was inserted, the expansion of the device caused damage to internal tissues, severe bleeding, and often death. The goal of the pear of anguish was to inflict extreme physical suffering and humiliation. It was often used as a method of coercion to force confessions, especially in those accused of heresy or other religious crimes. In addition to the physical pain, the torture had a significant psychological component, as the victim was subjected to long-lasting torture filled with anguish and fear. The head crusher was a torture tool designed to cause extreme damage to the victim's head. It consisted of a metal device, usually a cylinder or vise, that was tightened around the skull with the intent of crushing the bones of the head, including the skull and jaw. The pressure was gradually increased until the bones broke. The thumbscrew was a torture tool used primarily during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It consisted of a metal device with a screw that was placed on the victim's hands or feet, specifically on the thumbs, and tightened slowly. The goal was to crush the thumb bones, causing intense pain, fractures, and permanent damage to the joints. During the time the victim is buried, they experience extreme terror, not only from the lack of air, but also from the sense of helplessness and the terror of a slow and inevitable death. This method of torture was used in some ancient cultures and in periods of repression, such as military dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. The breast ripper was a device designed to inflict extreme pain and mutilation on women's breasts. This device generally consisted of a metal clamp or hook that was placed on the victim's breasts and tightened, tearing or cutting the flesh. The iron chair, also known as the chair of hell, was a torture tool made of iron with nails or blades affixed to it, where the victim was forced to sit, causing deep wounds and great suffering. This torture was used primarily during periods of war and repression, such as the Nazi regime. The lack of treatment for syphilis was practiced in the United States between 1932 and 1972. During this study, African American men diagnosed with syphilis were deliberately denied proper treatment. Even after the discovery of a cure, researchers chose to leave the prisoners in a state of suffering and degradation, just to observe the natural progression of the disease. The knee splitter was a torture tool that consisted of an adjustable metal device which was placed around the victim's knees, with blades or sharp pieces designed to press and split the joints. This method of torture aimed not only to cause extreme pain, but also to destroy the ability to move, resulting in permanent disability. Shaving women's heads was a humiliating and cruel practice, often used as a form of public punishment during periods of war and repression. During World War II, women accused of collaborating with enemies were forced to have their heads shaved in public squares as a symbol of shame and submission. The crushing torture involved the use of heavy tools to crush parts of the victim's body, such as hands or feet, causing pain, fractures, and irreparable damage. This practice was used to force confessions or severely punish prisoners. In some cases, prisoners were subjected to the crushing of their extremities, which resulted in permanent disability or slow death. The rack was a tool used to stretch the victim's body, forcing their limbs and joints to break, causing extreme pain. The victim was tied to the device, which was then turned, increasing pressure on the body. This method of torture was widely used during the English Civil War. The Spanish tickler was a torture technique that caused intense and forced tickling on the victim, usually on the soles of the feet, causing extreme physical and psychological suffering. This type of torture was designed to last for long periods, and over time it caused pain, exhaustion, and in some cases even physical damage, such as wounds on the hands or wrists due to the constant movement trying to escape. The heretic fork was a torture tool used primarily during the Middle Ages, especially during the Inquisition, to punish those accused of heresy or other religious offenses. The fork consisted of a device with 2 or more long and sharp teeth, usually made of metal, that were inserted into the victim's neck. The heretic fork was also used as a form of public punishment and humiliation, with the goal of showing the power of the church and the state over individuals. In addition to the physical suffering caused by the wounds and the inability to speak, the fork symbolized the brutality of the punishments used to control and silence those considered a threat to religious orthodoxy. Prisoners in Soviet gulags were victims of medical experimentation, although these experiments were not as well documented as those conducted by the Nazis. Reports of abuse and medical torture indicate that prisoners were used in tests of physical and psychological endurance, as well as improper medical treatments for infectious diseases. In torture contexts, the flamethrower was used to cause severe burns to the victim, spreading fire over the body in an indiscriminate and cruel manner. This method of torture resulted in irreparable damage to the skin, in addition to being extremely painful. The psychological impact was also significant, with the victim being subjected to the visible and relentless destruction of their body. The genetic selection experiment's torture was an inhumane practice carried out mainly by the Nazis, who sought to create a superior Aryan race. These experiments included blood transfusions between prisoners of different ethnicities and the attempt to create descendants of racial purity through forced relationships between prisoners. The simulated execution torture involved creating a situation where the victim is led to believe they will be killed, usually through scenarios in which death is about to be carried out, such as with the electric chair. This method aimed to cause extreme psychological suffering, increasing the victim's fear and anxiety. The vivisection torture was one of the most atrocious forms of medical experimentation, especially practiced by the Japanese Unit 731 during World War II. It consisted of dissecting live prisoners, usually without anesthesia, to study the effects of diseases, injuries, and extreme surgical techniques. Pressure chamber torture involved subjecting the victim to extreme pressure changes, causing intense physical and psychological suffering. This method was primarily used in military and espionage contexts, such as during the Cold War, where prisoners were forced to enter pressure chambers to test their endurance. The Judas cradle consisted of a wooden or metal device with a sharp point in the center where the victim was placed in a way that the point would pierce or press a part of the body, such as the anus, vagina, or genitals. This form of torture resulted in severe injuries and often the victim's death due to internal organ punctures or hemorrhaging. The simulated drowning, also known as water torture or waterboarding, was a form of psychological and physical torture in which the victim was submerged in water until they were about to suffocate. The goal was to create a sensation of imminent drowning, forcing the victim to feel panic and despair. The victim was briefly removed to breathe and then submerged again. Ling Chu, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, or slow death, was a brutal form of execution and torture used in Imperial China. This practice involved making progressive cuts to the victim's body, starting with non-vital areas and gradually moving to more vital parts, until the person died, often after hours of intense pain. The pincers and tongs were torture tools used to cause extreme pain and mutilation. These tools consisted of large metal pincers, or tongs, often heated, that were used to tear or crush parts of the victim's body, such as fingers, ears, nipples, or even the genitals. The crocodile tube was a brutal form of torture used primarily during the Middle Ages. It consisted of a metal tube, usually made of iron, that was placed in the victim's mouth, forcing the person to open their mouth in an extremely painful manner. The tube had a structure that expanded or was sharp, causing cuts and injuries to the mouth, teeth, and tongue of the victim. In some cases, the tube was heated, causing internal burns and severe damage. This form of torture aimed not only to inflict physical pain, but also to humiliate the victim, forcing them to endure extreme suffering. The meat hooks consisted of large metal hooks that were inserted into parts of the victim's body, usually in the back or shoulders, and the person was then suspended in the air, hung by the hooks. This method caused enormous physical suffering, damaging muscles, tissues, and joints, as well as resulting in severe internal damage. In some situations, the torturers used the enema to force the victim to consume substances that caused intense physical reactions, or even to poison the person slowly. During the Inquisition and in periods of political repression, the enema was used to humiliate victims or force confessions, serving as a method of physical and psychological control. The victim was tied and placed inside a metal structure in the shape of a V, where the arms and legs were bent at a painful angle, forcing the body to bend in an extreme manner, and the weight of their own flesh caused great pressure on the internal organs. In totalitarian regimes, such as China under the Communist Party, political prisoners, especially those accused of being members of sects, were subjected to medical experimentation. These experiments, often involving experimental drugs or forced surgeries, aimed to test the prisoners' physical endurance or their ability to withstand suffering. The iron feet consisted of iron pieces that were placed on the person's feet, usually tightly, with nails or pressure mechanisms. The goal was to crush the bones of the feet and hinder movement, making the victim vulnerable and preventing any attempt to escape. Electric shock involved applying electrical current to sensitive parts of the body, such as the genitals, tongue, or nipples, causing intense pain and internal damage. This method was used to force confessions, intimidate, or break the victim's psychological resistance, and was frequently applied during interrogations. The Chinese water torture was a mentally painful process in which cold water was slowly dripped onto the victim's scalp, forehead, or face over an extended period. The process caused fear and mental deterioration in the subject. The pattern of the drops is usually irregular, and the sensation of cold is intense, causing anxiety as the person tries to anticipate the next drop. The syringe was used as a torture tool in some authoritarian regimes, being used to inject harmful substances into the victim's body. In some cases, substances like hallucinogenic drugs, poisons, or chemicals were injected into the victims to test them, mentally manipulate them, or even force them to confess something under the effect of these substances. The chastity belt was a tool historically used with the claim of ensuring chastity, especially for women. Made of metal, this belt was placed around the genital area, restricting movement and preventing access to the body. In some versions, the belt contained iron mechanisms designed to cause pain or injury if the victim tried to remove it. The iron visor was a metal mask used to restrain the victim's head, often with a visor adjusted to restrict their vision and breathing. This device caused extreme discomfort, as well as hindering communication and the perception of the environment, which caused confusion and disorientation. The strappado was a torture method in which the victim's hands were tied behind their back and then suspended by the wrist, usually with ropes or chains, causing immense pain in the joints and shoulders. The body was left hanging, causing shoulder dislocation and ligament damage, often resulting in fractures or permanent injuries. Crucifixion is one of the oldest and most brutal forms of execution, with roots in ancient Rome and used by various empires and regimes throughout history. It involved tying or nailing the victim to a wooden cross, usually in both horizontal and vertical positions, and leaving them exposed to the public. Death occurred slowly due to the combination of suffocation, blood loss, and dehydration. Denailing was an extremely painful torture practice that involved the forced removal of the victim's nails from their hands or feet. This method caused permanent damage, as nails are sensitive and deeply connected to nerve and bone tissues. The process of removal could be done with tools like pliers, forceps, or even with the hands. Combing was a form of torture, sometimes fatal, in which iron combs designed to prepare wool and other fibers for spinning were used to scrape, tear, and flay the victim's flesh. The goal was to cause extreme pain and inflict damage, tearing pieces of skin, hair, or even causing deep injuries to the bones. The pau de arara was a form of torture that was widely used during the Brazilian military dictatorship, especially between the 1960s and 1980s. It consisted of tying the victim, usually in a very painful manner, to a post or structure, with their hands tied behind their back and their feet elevated so that the body would be suspended. The saw was a torture tool used slowly and meticulously, cutting the victim slowly, often starting with limbs such as arms or legs and eventually reaching vital organs. This method of torture was widely used in periods of political repression as a form of humiliation and to extract confessions brutally. The hammer was used as a torture tool in various forms throughout history, especially during periods of repression and in authoritarian regimes. Used to crush or fracture parts of the victim's body, such as hand, foot, or finger bones. One of the most brutal methods involved applying blows to the extremities bones, resulting in multiple fractures and hemorrhaging. The picana was a torture tool that used electric shocks, consisting of a device with a cord that ended in a metallic point, which was connected to a source of electric current. The picana was used to apply shocks to different parts of the victim's body, usually in sensitive areas, causing pain, burns, and in some cases, internal damage. The iron bed was a torture tool that consisted of a metal structure where the victim was tied, usually in an uncomfortable position, and immobilized. The goal was to cause extreme pain by forcing the victim's body to endure physical pressures for long periods, resulting in internal injuries, fractures, and damage to the joints. The hammer and nails torture involved using nails, usually large and sharp, to be driven into the victim's body, typically in the hands, feet, or other vulnerable parts, while the person was struck with a hammer. The breaking wheel was a brutal form of torture in which the victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, and their bones, especially the arms and legs, were broken with sticks or hammers, causing extreme suffering before death. After the bones were broken, the prisoner was often left exposed to the public, symbolizing control and intimidation. Extreme fatigue torture involved forcing the victim to perform strenuous labor for long periods without rest or proper food until their physical resistance was completely destroyed. This practice was commonly used in concentration camps and prisons during wartime, especially during World War II. Stoning involved throwing stones at the victim until they were severely injured or dead. This practice was frequently used as a form of public execution imposed by oppressive regimes or in religious punishment contexts. Foot whipping was a brutal form of torture involving the use of a whip or rod to strike the victim's feet. This method is especially painful because the feet contain many nerve endings, making the pain more intense. The torture is typically applied repeatedly, aiming to inflict prolonged suffering and leave the victims with severe physical injuries. The ducking stool was a method of punishment and torture primarily used in the Middle Ages and early modern era, especially in courts and during public trials. It consisted of tying the victim to a chair, which was then repeatedly submerged in a body of water, such as a river or lake, while the person was forced to be submerged and emerged again. Violent interrogation was a common practice during authoritarian regimes and wars, involving a combination of physical and psychological tortures to force the victim to confess information or crimes or to break their resistance. During the Brazilian military dictatorship, violent interrogation was widely used to suppress political opposition. The gag was a torture and control tool used to prevent the victim from speaking, shouting, or making any sound, causing both physical and psychological suffering. It consisted of a device placed in the person's mouth, often with a structure that forced the mouth open or prevented the proper closing of the lips. The tooth extraction was a torture practice, especially during periods of repression. This form of torture involved the forced removal of teeth, usually without the use of anesthesia, which caused pain and distress. The victim was subjected to tooth extractions as a form of punishment or to force confessions. Sleep deprivation was a form of psychological torture that involved preventing the victim from sleeping for prolonged periods, which caused extreme fatigue, mental disorientation, and hallucinations. The victim was kept in a constant state of vigilance, with no rest, which profoundly affected cognitive and emotional functioning. The lashings were a common form of physical torture used during military dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, consisting of using whips, rods, or belts to repeatedly strike the victim's back or other parts of their body, causing bruises. This method of torture aimed to inflict physical suffering while demoralizing and humiliating the victim, often in public, to serve as an example and intimidate the population. Flagellation was a form of torture that involved the use of whips, rods, or belts to repeatedly strike the victim's back or other parts of the body, causing intense pain, bruising, and injuries. Flagellation was commonly used as a form of physical punishment, especially during the Middle Ages. Public display involved subjecting and exposing the victim in front of an audience, with the goal of humiliating, intimidating, and demonstrating power. Frequently used as a form of psychological torture and social control, this practice was common during periods of war and authoritarian regimes, such as World War II. The padded cell is a room where the walls, floor, and ceiling are covered with padding. In torture contexts, especially during authoritarian or repressive regimes, this practice was used to subject prisoners to total isolation and sensory deprivation, causing great psychological suffering. The red-hot iron was a torture tool used to cause extremely painful burns. It consisted of a piece of metal heated to the point of incandescence, which was then pressed against the victim's skin. This practice caused immediate damage to the skin and deeper tissues, resulting in severe burns, permanent scarring, and in many cases, fatal infections. Sun exposure torture involved leaving the victim outdoors without shade or protection under the intense heat of the sun, causing severe dehydration, sunburns, and extreme exhaustion. This method of torture, frequently used in tropical regions, aimed to physically weaken the victim, forcing them to endure suffering until their body could no longer resist. The binding torture involved tying the victim in such a way that their joints were stretched and they were suspended in the air for long periods, causing extreme pain and irreparable damage to muscles and joints. Prisoners of war and civilians were often subjected to this technique to force confessions or break their physical and mental resistance. The food and water deprivation torture involved leaving prisoners without access to basic resources, such as food and water, with the goal of weakening them physically and mentally. This practice caused extreme dehydration, intense hunger, and in many cases, death. During World War II, it was widely used in concentration camps. The cigarette burning torture involved burning the victim's skin with the lit tip of a cigarette, usually on sensitive areas of the body, such as the arms, chest, or face. During repressive regimes, such as military dictatorships, cigarette burning was frequently used to intimidate prisoners. Confinement cages were small and restrictive structures in which the victim was forced to stay in uncomfortable positions, with no space to move for long periods. These cages were designed to cause physical suffering due to the tight confinement and lack of movement, leading to fatigue. The Shan mantle was a public punishment tool used during the Middle Ages to humiliate and torture offenders. It consisted of a type of heavy metal cloak or cape that was placed over the victim, covering them partially or entirely, with the intention of forcing them to walk in a constrained and humiliating manner. The Spanish donkey was a wooden structure in the shape of a bench or seat with a sharp point in the center. The victim was forced to sit on this point, with the weight of the body pressing on the genital area, causing injuries and hemorrhaging. In some cases, the victim was tied or kept balanced on the structure for long periods, which intensified the suffering. The flaying is one of the cruelest forms of torture and execution, involving the removal of the victim's skin, usually starting from the feet or hands, while the person is still alive. Flaying was used as a form of public punishment for serious crimes, such as treason, being carried out as a brutal warning to others. The enema was used as a form of torture in some historical periods, especially in punishment or interrogation contexts. It involved the forced introduction of liquids or substances into the victim's anus, causing extreme discomfort, pain, and, in many cases, internal damage. The scavenger's daughter was a torture tool used during the Inquisition and periods of repression, especially during the Middle Ages. It consisted of a metal device designed to crush the victim's body into a torturous position.